First off, yeah, thank you very much, Phil. I'm really pleased to be here. This is a pretty well-regarded conference, and when I told people that I had a chance to speak here, I got a lot of thumbs up and plus ones that it was an exciting place to come and talk, especially to a bunch of implementers, to people actually doing the work. So it's really exciting to be here and be able to talk a little bit about some of my experiences. This is me. I started my career as an engineer, as a software engineer, graduated with a CS degree way back in the day. And along the way, built teams on 3 continents, founded companies in the UK, in Vietnam, worked at IBM in China, and started a few development labs there as well. And I would say I left the US right as Agile and extreme programming and pair programming were just starting to become trends. But I was always really interested in them and put them to practice in the teams that I wound up founding. Pair programming, I think this is known to be a pretty good practice at this point. It's not that widely practiced, but the results are pretty in. This is a citation of a meta-analysis of papers and studies on pair programming. And the general trend is that it's known to be pretty effective in the context where it works. It produces work in less time than people working slowly. That's kind of the first chart, that pairing people tend to get to the answer in less time. The quality is notably better. The quality of outputs tend to be a lot better because you have live peer review going on. And people tend to enjoy it more. People just like collaborating in groups with people on their teams, and it's a fun process to build something together. Great. Do we need to look at sound quality at all, or are we good? I guess we'll continue. So this stuff is pretty well studied in engineering context, but we're not really here to talk about engineering. We're here to note, I think, first that pairing is a really highly leveraged activity, right? You put extra resources at a very targeted spot in the software development lifecycle, and then you get outsized results, much more than the extra resources that you're putting in. In software engineering, that leverage tends to come from increasing quality early on, right? Reducing the number of bugs that have to be found later, shortening feedback loops. We get a lot of leverage from pairing, and I can imagine that SDETs in the room have seen that in practice, right? If you've had the experience of pairing with engineers and showing them how to do things more effectively, how to plan out what tests they run more effectively, use the frameworks better, then you've seen examples of how driving quality early tends to produce much better results later on, right? That concept of leverage is where pairing really, really helps and has great knock-on effects in other activities as well, though. Leverage comes for different reasons, though. In leadership activities, what tends to happen at the manager and director level and product management level, you're making bigger decisions that affect the business either systemically or because you're kind of moving the ship in a new direction that should have a really big outsized effect on the business. Ideally, you're making better decisions there, and that's where pairing comes in. If pairing can help organizations make better decisions, transfer knowledge more widely across the organization, the effects of pairing should provide outsized improvements in those leadership activities. So that's what this talk is about. I'm going to tell a couple stories about times when I've deployed pairing in different kinds of cross-organizational situations, how I deployed it, what made that successful in the specific situations. I got one story of kind of the business side and the product side, talking about how pairing really, got to a result that we might not have done otherwise. I've got another story of kind of modifying an organization's delivery process and using pairing to generate alignment about how we might take on some, kind of scary new process for that organization. And then the last one is, going to be my favorite. It's about pairing as management, kind of working with your managers, with managers underneath you, and deploying pairing in a way that just had some of the best professional successes of my career. By systemically improving how management got done through pairing. So let's get into it. This is the first story, a little background here. I was a product manager at a company called Viber. Not that popular an app in the US, but pretty popular worldwide. If you think of WhatsApp, Viber is roughly the same thing, but purple. It's a messaging app, very popular in the developing world, especially, although WhatsApp and a few others kind of ate its lunch in the biggest firms. It's a really big organization. It's kind of one of the national champions of Israel. That's where most of its product and technical leadership was. They had probably about 200-300 engineers in Belarus. And they had a little team in San Francisco that was me, that was trying to do things in a more Silicon Valley style of integrated product and engineering delivery out there. So in that context, I was running e-commerce for this messaging app. And most of the e-commerce they had at the time was things like selling stickers or doing cross-promotional events, getting brands to place something inside the app. And revenue was growing, but in that context, they bought this little startup in San Francisco that had a shopping keyboard. Basically, you could swap out your keyboard and replace that with a little product browser. And then if users found something they liked, they could buy it. Fantastic. The business model was drive a transaction, get some affiliate revenue whenever somebody actually buys something. So we bought this company, got a pretty great browsing experience built into the app, launched it at 150 countries, had 5 million monthly active users, and we're making around like $100 or $200 a month. Terrible uptake. Drove almost no transactions, very unsuccessful. $10 million purchase, making the company about $100 a month after a solid year of engineering resources integrating in it and getting it live, right? So not Dan's most successful position that he's ever been in, right? Around that time, as I'm kind of coming to terms with, well, this seems to have been a bad purchase. This isn't really working out. A separate group in Viber out in France was working on an ads platform. It happens that Viber has been historically anti-advertising up to this point, but they were exploring it, seeing what they could do. And so I found out them right at the time when I needed an alternative source of revenue. Now, I noted that this firm was in France. This part of the company was rather notorious for, not shipping things very quickly, for being somewhat bureaucratic. I'm not making no stereotypes about French organizations here when I say that they didn't have a reputation for shipping things pretty quickly, and they were known to be a little bit difficult to work with, specifically because they wanted heavy planning for any move that they really made. So here I am in San Francisco working as a PM, and my challenge is to get this other part of the organization working effectively with me in a way that can generate some results and prove out a business case that I have in my mind for, hey, if we have 5 million people looking at this thing every month, what if we show them some ads and maybe some of those ads get clicked on? That's a real number of users looking at ads. That actually drives some revenue that we desperately lack. But the problem here, as it often is execution. Easy to say, hard to make happen. So enter pairing. I didn't talk about pairing. I didn't, say, let's pair on this thing, French product manager counterpart. What I did was get introduced, ask him to join a meeting, set up 90 minutes on the calendar. And then when he showed up, I had a shell of a document ready to go. And it was a template for an experiment design, a little lightweight PRD that would describe something that my team was ready to implement, that wouldn't require them to do anything or build anything. All I needed was their advice and expertise on what would make a good experiment. And within 90 minutes, we had it written, and we had something that my team could get out the door in a couple of weeks and then show a little bit of progress. Hey, look, if we take a few standard size ads and put some sample ads in those, look at the click-through rates we get. Well, what if we multiply that by a CPC? This is starting to sound interesting. And so we fell into that pattern. Every 2 weeks at the beginning, and then every week after that, we wound up pairing together on whatever the next artifact in the process was that would either feed engineering or feed a report to his management team or design the next step of the roadmap as we kind of develop this, this business case over about a quarter's worth of experimentation. Never said the word pairing, but deployed a bunch of pairing techniques in that we were always working on a document. This person's Expertise was always part of the equation. You know, it was never I have an idea. It was always what if we do X, what if we do Y, and totally fell into my trap. Absolutely, wound up working very effective with me after a while to generate a lot of excitement, both in their part of the org and in mine. And, you know, by the end of that calendar year, we had an approved business plan for pushing their advertising platform forward so we could move to ads at scale. So pairing PM to PM, working together on the artifacts that we were generating, and drove execution in a way that kind of historically had been hard to find with that group. Pretty great success, and it was the first time I really deployed pairing in a product situation. This is the next story. This one's a little more developer centric, especially for engineering process nerds. This might be a fun one. The context here was that I was working with a Series D fintech firm. For reasons that will become obvious as we talk about them. They are going to remain anonymous for this conversation. My firm was engaged to help these folks move from their colo into the cloud. First time moving into AWS, and in the process, build them their first infrastructure as code delivery stack so that they could get the entire organization into CI/CD, mandatory automated testing before anything went out, automated deployments, the whole 9 yards. So it was a very big kind of technical debt takeout for this organization. And this is what their organization looked like. Not very cross-functional. Their teams were organized horizontally around the different components that they managed. And a lot of the different parts of the engineering process had separate teams that managed them. Their QA team was not tightly integrated with these teams. You can imagine being a PM in this process and coming up with some product change and then having to walk it through 6 teams worth of individual work streams. And then every time hop back and forth with their QA team. And then if you ever want to deploy things to a QA or a staging or out to production, then there's a separate TPM group that handles all that stuff. So this firm was having some trouble getting work out the door, as you can imagine, right? You know, imagine being a PM working across all these teams. Imagine there being 10 of you, 10 PMs trying to do the same thing. Imagine being one person and one engineer in one of these teams, and there's always at least 5 PMs yelling at you about how their stuff is currently the highest priority and needs you to drop everything right away to get this thing out the door. Living in this kind of organization, probably some of us have lived in this kind of team, in this kind of setup before. It kind of sucks. You get a lot of smart people who have real trouble getting work out the door because of the way their organization is kind of managing themselves. And it results in a pretty defensive attitude. When you're in one of these teams and you can see that work isn't really progressing fast, it's hard to understand why. You've got a process, people are trying to follow it, but it's really hard to enforce quality in a situation like this. It's hard to develop ownership when everything is so matrixed and time sliced and there's always so much work in progress that everybody's sitting there waiting on before anything gets to production. So people get pretty defensive and they get pretty uncomfortable with change. They know things are broken. They don't know why. They really start to focus on, well, as long as everyone knows it's not my fault, then things are okay. Really common to develop that kind of attitude in an organization that's at scale having trouble shipping work. So in this context, we're moving these folks to the cloud. The first thing we took was that web front end, that big React monolith that they had. Big monorepo, 7 different products, all the same thing. One team managing the whole thing. Okay, we're not trying to re-architect your system. We're just trying to get it over into automated deployment land. And with maybe about 2 weeks ahead of schedule, we run into a slight problem, which is that the deployment automation strategy we'd been following was based on their current feature branching strategy, Git flow, for people who have been involved in it, and their VP of engineering at this point comes in and says, absolutely not. I never wanted Git flow. I've always wanted trunk-based development. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the difference between these two, so I'll just summarize by saying trunk-based development expects the individual teams to test really thoroughly at a pretty high degree of quality and maturity. There's higher expectations on teams and a little bit more risk, because with trunk-based development, you're relying more on the automated checks to validate your confidence in the work, rather than having more peer reviews and more, more personal reviews in Git flow. So VP engineering over there says, no, I want the more modern, slightly more risky, slightly more maturity demanding style. And Dan, always the teacher's pet, happens to say in a large room, of about 15 leaders, that Dan thinks that's a pretty good idea. And we like this aggressive move into more quality, higher expectations for the engineering teams. My reward was that I got put in charge of it. I deserved it very much. So at this point, I have about 2 weeks of buffer time in our release schedule to get this thing out and prove that we can move big parts of their architecture into the cloud. And I got a director at the top of every one of these groups that is severely uncomfortable with change, especially with change that implies that quality is going to be both, that have higher expectations of them in an org that hasn't ever really seen that. Okay, what do we do? How do we approach this? The real insight here, I think, was that we had pretty full confidence that this style of development, relying a little bit more on deployment automation, that stuff works. So we were pretty confident that they weren't going to run into huge problems in executing this change, and most of the problem was kind of the fear and discomfort with change that the organization had. So address that by pairing with every one of these directors. Over about 2 weeks, we were doing probably about 3 sessions a day with different people at the tops of these groups. And every one of those sessions followed this pattern where, okay, I or my engineering counterpart shows up to a meeting. We've got a doc that everybody's been working on that describes the new feature branching strategy. And we start pulling from all these directors, what are the risks you see? They start talking about, oh, this could go wrong and I don't know how this will work, et cetera. All of it dutifully gets written down into the new, into the strategy doc we're putting together. Great. We see these risks. Do you see any mitigations for it? What could we validate along the way to see whether we're falling short here or not? All of those got put into the document. And then the third thing that we would ask them is, what is your team going to be able to contribute to help make this change work? What part of this win is your team going to be able to claim when, should things work? And so we did a couple things at the same time with this activity. We were building the strategy doc together. So we were incorporating all of their fears into it and calling them out. So they all felt like their butts were covered if things go wrong. They also were all putting down all the places where their teams would be part of the success should this turn out to work and successfully deploy code. And finally, they had ownership through creating it, right? Typically what would happen is they'd be talking through things, we'd be typing it up in the doc, we'd be reflecting that back to them. Then they would nod and say, yes, that's what I meant. That's you saying the correct version of what my fear was. Actually, yes, that's what I meant. So they were not only kind of assuaged in their fears and given ownership of the win, they were also kind of walked through how to think and talk about this in a way that fit into the overall strategy. So 2 weeks later, we probably after maybe 3 or 4 sessions with each of these folks, we had everybody kind of signing off on their aspects of the change to trunk-based development. Okay, and we got to the final meeting with the VP of engineering, and everybody said, okay, well, I have worries and we need this and so on, but I see these ways where I'm going to check very carefully and put my team at fault. Part of this falls down, so tentative thumbs up. Tentative thumbs up was all we needed. We shipped that React monolith into AWS. You will be shocked to learn that it worked fine and that teams were able to start deploying on it the very next week. didn't have any special rollbacks, didn't have any deployment failures. And I'll say it took about a month for them to stop feeling like they needed to have 12 people in the room for every deployment. And that number started to, took a little while for that number to start going down. But, by about 3 months later, they had 2 people in the room for deployments usually, instead of what had been 12. They were releasing code during the working day, which is a thing they'd never done. They'd always kind of said, we won't release on Friday because what if it breaks over the weekend? We won't release during the working day because what if it breaks while in the middle of doing things? And then after a month of successful front-end deployments, they weren't quite so worried, and they found they had better things to do with their nights and weekends than kind of stay up late on a big call and see if this deployment worked. And we wound up processing through the entire stack and getting it through. So going back to sharing, what was the big advantage that we got out of this? The big advantage was that you had a lot of people who were not really sure how to think about a system that they hadn't ever worked in or felt comfortable releasing in. And we were able to get everybody into a place where they could own the positives of the outcome. They felt like they had been fully heard, and they were completely, the risks that they were most worried about were covered. And we got permission to succeed for permission to move forward from everybody. This is a broadly consensus-driven organization, and we got to consensus on a big change, and that in itself became a proof point for, hey, wait, maybe we can together and have them actually succeed. Little cautious optimism resulted from that. So, big organization. This is about 200 engineers who worked in this organization. And, maybe it's been about a year and a half now since then. And they've kind of taken this and continued to evolve. They've got their DevOps team is successfully managing line on their own, and they've managed to push individual teams, but about half the teams have been refactored and are now focused around products rather than technical components. And those product-oriented teams have their own pipelines and their own ability to kind of migrate aspects of their repo onto new pipelines that they fork off. And the DevOps team is successfully enabling the delivery teams with what they need to work automated. All right, last one. My personal favorite. This one is my personal favorite because I got a bone to pick with how management leadership gets taught. I find that management and leadership is one of those things where the most wonderful people might get put in charge of things, but there's often an expectation that you're a leader now. You should be perfect. We shouldn't be seeing mistakes from you. And that pressure kind of, leads people to turtle up a little bit and maybe be a little less transparent with how they're working together. And that's leads to a lot of first-time leaders kind of making the same mistakes over and over again. There's a lot of, when people talk about management and leadership, they often characterize the outcomes that you want to see. A great leader knows their people extraordinarily well. A great leader, can let somebody know exactly where they're at performance-wise very clearly, and then they'll understand and improve based on that. But there's very little education of, well, how do I actually do that? How do I give feedback to people when I don't really understand how they see value in the world? How do I build relationships with, all the millions of kinds of humans that there are in the world? There are techniques for that. There are very teachable ways to get people started on building relationships, giving feedback, doing, et cetera, that aren't often taught in a structured way. And this is kind of what you get. You wind up with, people who are kind of doing the thing, but there's something missing. There's some kind of piece of theory or practice that isn't really there, and they don't wind up getting the full outcome that they really want. And you see kind of first-time leaders at every level, whether it's your first time as a manager, first time as a VP, kind of stubbing their toes on the same sets of collaboration issues, the same sets of team enablement issues, et cetera. So, pairing is the answer to everything. That's what this talk is about, right? Well, actually, in a management and leadership, there's as many opportunities to pair. You know, if you're running a team of any kind of engineer, it's pretty likely that the person running that team has a lot of delivery experience doing that thing, and you could pair in and help them literally do the thing and provide context and skills training, and it would work. I have not yet figured out how to pair in for a one-on-one. See, I haven't figured that out. One might maybe need some like sci-fi cybernetic technology to get in somebody's brain, maybe someday in the future. So especially in a lot of the core management practices, there aren't as many opportunities to pair as you might expect in other places. But there are opportunities, and they are golden valuable. I'll tell you a story here of kind of the first time that I was a director and where I realized that, oh my gosh, pairing, it works here. It works here too. This was actually before both of the other two stories. This is maybe about 10 years ago at this time, 12, 15 years ago. And I was a director at a startup in Vietnam. Had my first teams of managers working underneath me. And they had, kind of come up in a development culture that was mostly about lower cost outsourcing. So pretty micromanagerial, not a whole lot of empowered teams and great leadership in those contexts. And that was the environment that these folks had grown up in, these managers, right? So we're working at scale. We're 30 people at this time, and that's when I roll out, some pretty standard stuff. We're gonna have levels. We're gonna have professional development plans for everybody. We're gonna have kind of specific skills checkpoints between the levels that measure whether you're operating at greater scale and enabling teams of engineers that you work with. And we also had a group of people who hadn't really ever worked in an environment that resulted in empowered teams and training. At the time, it was you would see this outcome in stuff like retention. When people aren't being developed that well, they kind of think, well, whatever, every job is crap. I'll just go to the next place that offers me more. And because we're waiting for annual reviews, we didn't have the conversation quite often enough to recognize that somebody had grown a fair amount and could go get a much higher paying job, because that's the way the market worked at the time. So we rolled out the development plans and the levels, but ultimately those are kind of documents, in Slide or Notion or wherever you put them now, or Confluence. And they're not actually the relationship between the manager and their employees, right? So in the process of rolling out this new, slightly scaled up leveling system, I wound up moving to quarterly reviews and setting up a system of pairing with all the managers, at first, just to teach them how all these documents worked. And what it very quickly evolved into was, okay, first you pair on building a development plan for one of your people. And we're going to sit together, we're going to write a document that describes how they're going to develop, what kind of points we've seen, what our plans are for them. And for every one of your staff, we'll pair for a bit on the development plan, and then you'll pair with the staff on kind of writing it up and validating it from the staff's perspective and getting them to add to it and make their own plans. And then you and I will take a look at it again and pair on it again to finalize this quarter's review. The types of conversations that we'd have would be how specifically are you thinking through and validating what you've seen about somebody's performance? What words are you using to describe it? Are those words that they can recognize and kind of take action from? Or are they kind of general words like, this person did this well. This person is a nice person. Perfectly wonderful things to say, but they're not really actionable things that a manager might, tell to one of their staff that would help them improve. So in the context of writing these plans and setting it up, there's what I thought originally was an explanation of how the docs and the leveling system work turned into really quickly conversations about how do you have performance improving conversations with your team. And that wound up being the main value of these sessions. Now, if you're thinking this through, you might think, so Dan had 2 pairing sessions, and then the manager had a pairing session, and you did it for everybody across the teams every quarter. That sounds like a lot. If you're thinking this, you are absolutely correct. It was a heck of a lot, and it was very uncomfortable. The first time you go through and start talking about performance and talk about how you're evaluating the team with somebody who may have been a manager for quite a number of years, for a number of people who might have been a manager longer than I had been a manager, right? The first time you go through that, it's really difficult to talk through how you think about these things. We won't even get into the fact that it's happening in Vietnam and most people are working in a second language. That discomfort persisted for a little while. It's definitely, it was a lot of work and growth for them and for me to be able to explain what they're thinking in a difficult context. And then for me to kind of process and like what I'm thinking in an equally difficult context for me. You know, I thought I understood how these things worked and why it all fit together, but until you've articulated it, you know, 300 or 400 times, you don't actually know it that well. So what we found was every time we started, the first one of these was pretty uncomfortable and felt like a really big lift. It took about 2 complete cycles, 6 months worth of performance reviews for that to really change. You know, it got a little bit easier quickly, but it didn't get a lot easier until everybody had 15 or 20 reps through the process with their folks. And at that point, suddenly it kind of stopped being an issue. The meetings became a bit a breeze. We could work through several people in the same session, and outcomes for the organization were huge and really noticeable. The places where this showed up first was our retention rate. We after starting about a year after starting to work with people and rolling out the new professional development plan and pairing with all the managers, we got down to 25% of the Vietnam software industry average retention rate. You know, we were having 1/4 the turnover that other firms were having. And for people who have worked, I mean, almost anybody could recognize that when you feel and know that your managers are taking care of you and helping to improve you, you know, day in, day out, when you feel your value increasing, that resonates like few other things will. And that's the effect that we were getting out of working to make sure that the managers at scale over time were doing a really good job of, you know, reviewing everybody's performance and planning out their careers and thinking through how we could put people in a good position to succeed in the future. The other fun way that this reflected was before this happened, you would see a lot of people who would just kind of rock up and say, hey, I got a job offer. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But I just think you should pay me $1,000 more because that's what I think. And I'll also say that especially as the foreigner boss, there was like that was part of the conversation too. There was an expectation that that's how you negotiated and how you had compensation discussions. Once we instituted this program, that entire phenomenon went away because we were able to change the conversation between the company and the person from, well, okay, I guess the way I get promoted is by, you know, doing a hard salary-based negotiation. Suddenly it was a co-op game with a staff member and their manager working against the level system. And there was a very clear, you know, set of things you could do to level yourself up and validations you could get and skills that you could get reviewed on that would show that you were providing more and more scale and more impact and get promoted. And we set it up so that people could expect to be getting promoted every like 4 or 5 cycles, roughly every year. So this situation was probably the single highest leverage, you know, execution of pairing that I ever wound up in. It really changed the feeling of the company and the culture of the company. And I think the thing that changed it the most was the fact that it was very obvious to staff that managers were leaning in and working to provide value to them. It was a demonstration of servant leadership, and you know, everyone can tell. Everyone can tell when their bosses are broadcasting to them versus working with them to build them up. Everyone's had the conversation where your boss walks in and, oh, well, this is your decision and how do you want to do it? But you know that there's a right answer that's in their mind. And going back to pairing, one of the fundamental ideas of pairing is that you have to respect the other person's position and where they're coming from. If they have an idea for how to proceed, you have to say, okay, well, let's think that through. Let's find a way to test it, model it, see how it performs in action. At least, you have to take it seriously. And if you just stamp it out as a leader, everyone will know instantly. But if you don't, if you actually collaborate, people will recognize that just as much. And that promotes a cultural change that's incredibly valuable. Summarizing real quick, this is a little screen grab of me pairing on the prep for this talk a few months ago. And you can see a couple of the things that I've been talking about that I think are the fundamental requirements of pairing. The first one of those I call mutual purpose. You both have to be in there to do a thing, and that thing really should be creating something together. Creating a plan is okay if actually writing the document at the time, but creating that'll be used to create software, that's way better. Creating a test plan together is very effective and far more effective than having a meeting to discuss it. So mutual purpose means you're building something together. It's not a meeting, it's a working session with an output. Mutual attention, I think, is another important thing. You see my cameras on in here? Both people, cameras on, live, doing the thing together. That's what humans actually want. Somebody's camera off, if getting distracted by DMs, whatever. Okay, I guess this person isn't actually engaged. Anybody will think that if you show up to do a thing together and you start into it, and the other person's dropping out or checking Facebook or whatever. You see it in live engineer pairing sessions all the time, that kind of one of the secret values of this is that he's going to check Facebook when there's somebody next to them and they're there to do a thing, right? There's a lot less kind of like accidental distraction and slacking. And that's a thing that you want to really lean into when you're pairing engineering as well. At the fintech firm that we were working with, one of the patterns we kind of verbally coached everybody through pairing sessions was, oh, hey, I'm gonna put my Slack on do not disturb right now. I'm gonna put my phone away. And that prompted everybody to kind of focus in a way that they might not have otherwise and respond to fewer DMs. And it just feels better when you're both kind of fully attentive to the thing. The last thing is, I mentioned it a little bit before, but mutual respect has to be there. If you come into a pairing session thinking, I know the answer to this, I know how to, all I need to do is convince this other person to do it my way. As clever as you think you are, they will be able to tell that you came in there just looking to lay down the law, especially if you're in a leadership, position relative to them. So this is a lot of the trick, right? Is processing their thoughts in a respectful way and making sure that everybody's contributions are going into the output that you're creating together. That's about it. Those are a couple of stories of times I took pairing out into the rest of the product development world, and sure enough, good habits of working together have really nice knock-on effects when you can deploy them. You can get really nice scale. You can get really nice, kind of tactical outputs from them. But I'll say my favorite aspect of pairing in leadership is that it promotes a culture of real servant leadership, right? That when leaders get together and do things together and build things together, it's just as exciting for them. And when they're doing it with their teams, it's much more exciting for teams because it's really, really rare to have a boss who's actually getting in there, rolling up their sleeves and helping you succeed. And this is one of the patterns that kind of creates that outcome for teams. So hope you all enjoyed it. I believe we have some space for questions. Is that right, Phil? There's a couple of different versions of it. The 3 stories, the first one was 2 product managers, kind of same function, but in different parts of the organization. Pairing pairing together. The second one was cross-functional leadership pairing. So people, somebody at the director or manager level pairing with a different function that ran a different team in order to produce a document. And then the last one was pairing in. You as a manager, whatever level you're managing at, pairing into your work on your team and report to you, helping them do the work that they're doing for their success.
Question online for the managers all meet.
The way that I handled that question, and that's really important, I think, is not to say the word pairing a lot. Setting up a working session, but I'll say one of the kind of principles I tend to follow is, in a properly transparent organization, you can set a meeting with somebody at any time. And as long as you tell them the agenda and what's going on and kind of check with them over DMs, let them know that this is happening, should be that people are pretty open, especially within leadership, to kind of coming together. And I didn't use the term pairing. I didn't describe what I was doing. I just set up a situation and started asking questions and started getting people involved. And that meant I wasn't imposing something from the outside. I was asking for advice. One of my favorite sayings is, if you ask for money, you're going to get advice. But if you ask for advice, you have a much better chance of getting money out of it. And that's the strategy we take here. Don't tell people we're going to do it a certain way. Ask them for their good advice and help, and then see what kind of collaboration you get. HR was not involved in any of these stories. All these stories were examples of people wanting to do a thing, and how do we go and do that thing together, right? So it wasn't a policy that we're setting out that everyone must do it this way. This was just, we want to get an outcome. We want to create something. How do we go about executing that? How do we work together to get an outcome? And we use the patterns of pairing as usually just two people at a time in order to get better outcomes. So there was never a situation where we needed anybody's approval but the people who were in the working session to proceed in a certain way. And usually if you are working on something and you share a goal together, then people kind of want to achieve the goal. People innately want to work together and succeed together because it feels good. So didn't get bureaucracy involved, didn't look for permission in these cases. Yeah. The most common thing that I run into is people bounce off the process because it's not the kind of work that they're looking to do, or they're not available to do the kind of work. I think in a lot of organizations that are really heavily time sliced and don't kind of make time for deep work on any particular topic, you'll find that leaders are so heavily scheduled and letting their calendars run their lives that all they've really got for anybody is 30 minutes a little while from now. And if they're kind of more focused up than they are in, then that focus away from the execution of their teams will kind of lead to them being like, later, I don't have time for this right now, or this is not, this is not the way I proceed. So usually in that case, the issue was, I'm trying to pair with somebody who's actually not that much of an executor. And if I need to, in the French case at Viber, that's what happened early on, because the first introductions I got were to the leaders of the group over in France that were not, they had a nice gig. They had low expectations on them. They weren't trying to rock any boats. If it takes them a year or so to discover something, they're fine. I had to go to the actual delivery people, to the people who were trying to run teams and run experiments and build knowledge. And by going a little bit deeper into the org, I was able to find people who wanted to create. And those are the people that you wind up being allies with. Pairing is more effective with them. And the success that you get from working with them will kind of speak for itself.